Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Battle of Talas 751, Abbasid Tang War by Kings and Generals. So we've actually touched on this topic before when we watched Kings and Generals' video on the last Sassanids, a video about how the Sassanid court fled east from the encroaching Muslim caliphate to Tang, China, and they sort of cemented an alliance. Now, this battle is a couple decades after that took place, but it's some interesting context to have in mind. Now, if you guys enjoy this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
This video was suggested and sponsored by our Patreon supporter Fahad Al-Mandil. Supporting us on Patreon is the best way to propose and sponsor a new video.
Hey, same thing here. If you want to suggest reactions to me or see exclusive content, then check out my Patreon, which is linked down below.
Both the Muslim Abbasid Caliphate and the Chinese Tang dynasty had been expanding their territories towards Central Asia, and their growth finally culminated at the Battle of Talas in 751.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see this conflict emerge because, we have the Abbasid Caliphate and we have the Tang dynasty of China. So the Caliphate and China. Of course, they were both moving towards each other, but when I think about these two great entities, these two empires, I think of them very separately. China I think of as far more east, and the Caliphate I think of as far more west. But this really shows you how large these two empires were getting, that they were actually meeting in the middle in Central Asia. And like I said in the introduction, we saw in the video on the last Sassanids that though at that point, a couple decades before this, the Caliphate and the Tang dynasty of China weren't yet interested in fighting each other, their interests were sort of brushing up against each other. And so, if you looked down the road a little, you might be thinking, okay, well, they are starting to have some conflicting interests. Maybe they will actually fight. And that's what we're seeing here. So, very interesting topic.
This conflict is relatively unknown, and its initial results changed very little in the region. However, the ripples created by this battle would have a number of implications in later centuries and influence the history of the world.
Okay, I didn't know this battle was that important. Like they said, it's relatively unknown. I had not heard of this battle until some of you suggested this video, so I think, like many people watching this video, this will be my first time learning about all of this.
The Tang dynasty came to power in China in 618 and started its expansion towards the west. By 630, the territory of the Eastern Turkic Khaganate was incorporated into the Tang domain, and by 657, the Western Turkic Khaganate was decisively defeated. Despite the rivalry with the Tibetan Empire to the south and the Second Turkic Khaganate to the north, by 715, the Tang Empire became the biggest Chinese state since the Han, and gained vast influence in Central Asia, with many of the smaller states in the region becoming its vassal. To the west, the Muslim Caliphate managed to defeat both the Eastern Roman and the Sassanid empires in the middle of the...
And we saw all of these in our reaction to the early Muslim expansion series. Right now, Kings and Generals are highlighting two of the most important battles from this whole campaign, you could call it, this time period, Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah. These are two battles where the Caliphate respectively dealt massive damage to the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. Now, the Romans would manage to continue for a long time afterwards, even though they were weakened by these Muslim raids, but the Sassanids would not make it, and the Sassanid Empire would crumble not too long after this battle.
7th century, and established a vast empire of its own. A new Umayyad dynasty controlled territory from Spain to Central Asia, and from Arabia to the Caucasus.
Yep. And like we mentioned, we just saw the fall of the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Sassanid court had to keep fleeing eastwards as the Caliphate kept pushing eastwards. And as I mentioned, eventually the Sassanid court would flee to Tang Dynasty China, and they would form sort of a relationship. Though, of course, at that point, the Sassanid court didn't hold too much power anymore, since they held no land.
The Caliphate fought a number of local wars against the Turkic tribes of Central Asia, and by 715 controlled most of Transoxiana. The two great empires now shared control of the Silk Road. A conflict became inevitable. The details of the initial clashes are not clear, but we know that the first conflict occurred in the Ferghana Valley in 715. Despite Tibetan assistance, the Muslims were defeated. The same thing happened 2 years later, when the Chinese sent an army of Karluk mercenaries who beat the Arabs and Tibetans. Umayyad expansion was also curbed by revolts. A number of them failed, but finally, in 750, a rebellion led by As-Safar defeated the Umayyads, and the new Abbasid dynasty.
I mean, the Umayyad Caliphate was shaken by these civil wars, these fitnas, as they're called. It was roiled by political turmoil, and as we saw in our early Muslim expansion series, that seriously stopped expansion for a while. Not too long. I mean, considering how large the empire became, we're not talking about too long a span of time, but all of this civil conflict did halt expansion for a bit. And of course, it's worth remembering that when we look at sort of this Central Asian region, where now the Tang Dynasty and the Caliphate are sort of fighting over control of the all-important Silk Road, this route where a lot of these expensive and valued goods are transported from the east to the west. This is sort of at the furthest extent of both empires, Both the Caliphate and China have to send resources and manpower quite a distance to get to this point. So that's worth keeping in mind.
Came to power. It seems that the Chinese knew about the internal strife within the Caliphate and attempted to use it to subdue Central Asia. In 747, the local Chinese commander Gao Xianxi started a campaign against the city-state of Gilgit, which was allied to the Tibetan Empire. His victory in this campaign was swift. He was appointed the governor of the region and forced many petty kingdoms to become Tang vassals. The local states of Ferghana and Tashkent were feuding during that period. The former asked for the Chinese to help, and in the spring of 750, Gao attacked and captured Tashkent. The princes of Tashkent had no other choice but to call upon the Arabs. The local Muslim force led by Ziyad ibn Salih left Samarkand and started marching along the Talas River. Gao was slowly retreating to unite with his Karluk allies. The two armies finally met in the second half of 751, somewhere along the modern-day border of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan.
Here we go.
The numbers of participants in the battle are recorded very differently across the Arabic and Chinese sources.
Of course. And that's just a real interesting thing to hear. Oftentimes, because we've done a fair amount of history on the early Caliphate on this channel, and oftentimes we'll talk about how, the Arab sources might have conflicted with the Persian sources or the Roman sources or the Gothic sources or whatever. This is the first time we've really talked about the Arabic sources might conflict with the Chinese sources. Once again, I know it makes sense, these two empires meeting at this point, but there is, sort of a novelty, I think, to this conflict. Like I mentioned earlier, we've got the Caliphate versus China, two empires that I think of in very different contexts, but they're meeting in the middle here. It's just sort of funny to hear that, I guess.
Former claim that both sides had around 100,000 troops, while the latter insists there were about 200,000 Caliphate troops and 30,000 Tang warriors.
Yeah, I find that quite hard to believe. I mean, 200,000? That would be an absolutely massive number of troops from the Caliphate versus 30,000, even honestly 100,000 each. Now, I'm not sure how many men the Tang dynasty could corral. I really don't know. Could mobilize, but the Caliphate sending 100,000 men out this far east, even that is a gigantic army. So, I don't know.
However, the flow of battle suggests that there was parity between both sides. And as the battle took place on the edges of the two empires, hundreds of kilometers away from their respective centers with very little prior preparation, it is conceivable that both sides had between 30 and 50,000.
Yeah. And this is what we get with all the sources of this time period. Every time we talk about a battle, we said the same thing when we were looking at the Muslim conquest of Iberia. All the sources say there were 100,000, 150, 200,000 men. And we go, no, it was probably less than 50,000. And that's exactly what they're saying here. A lot of times, way less than 50,000. So yeah, 2,000, absolutely a ridiculous number of men to have. Even 100,000 on both sides, I very much doubt it.
Ziyad ibn Salih's army consisted of Arabic troops, with added contingents from the Tibetan Empire and the Turkic-Turkish Khaganate. Gao's forces were predominantly from China, with an infusion of local allied troops from Ferghana. The sources are not clear on whether the Karluk Turks were with Gao from the beginning of the battle or didn't join his army at all. The Chinese army was more infantry heavy, while their counterparts had an equal number of cavalry and infantry units. There are two central depictions of the battle, and we will present both of them.
Okay.
According to the first, Ziyad ibn Salih deployed his troops in a standard formation. A line of archers in front, spearmen behind them, heavy cavalry in the rear, with his guard and the light cavalry in reserve. Gao similarly had his crossbowmen and archers in front, with his spearmen in the second line, his guard and the Ferghana contingent in the third, with Karluk Turks on his extreme flanks. The first 3 days of the battle were nearly identical. The Chinese troops attacked across the front, and their archers got the better of their counterparts, dealing substantial damage to the enemy missile units.
I wonder if the inclusion of crossbowmen made any difference there. I'm not too familiar with the weaponry of this period, the difference, and how significant a difference it would be between having an archer and a crossbowman, how advanced the crossbow technology was. If the Chinese had different crossbow technology than the Arabs, you get my point. I'm not sure how much of a difference that would make. But aside from that, these two formations do seem fairly similar. And as Kings and Generals said, from what we know, seems like there may have been parity in the number of troops. So it makes sense that, we would have back and forth, a bit of a stalemate for a couple of days.
The Arab archers had to retreat behind their spearmen, and the infantry lines collided. As Gao's spearmen had better armor, they managed to push the foe back. The Muslim general attempted to alleviate the pressure on his infantry by sending his heavy cavalry to attack the lighter Karluk cavalry on the Chinese flanks. This attack failed to outflank Gao's units, but the Chinese general had to move his reserves into the fray. A similar sequence of events happened on the second and third days, but on the fourth day, the Karluk Turks betrayed the Chinese and attacked their infantry from the flanks, while the Arab army made a frontal.
Well, that's the danger when you're dealing with local politics. Remember, these are two great empires fighting rather far from their capitals, from the center of their empires. They're dealing with a lot of local politics, local allies, local enemies, local tribes, countries, kingdoms, empires. And so you sort of have to deal with all of that as you fight against this other great empire, one from the east and one from the west, and you risk something like this happening.
Charge. Gao's army collapsed. Between 10 and 20,000 Arabs died in this battle, while the Chinese probably lost close to 30,000.
Wow!
The second account of the battle is very different.
Reverse.
The Chinese and Muslim forces did not dare to attack each other for 4 straight days, while a third army, a smaller Karluk force stayed beyond the Talas River, not joining either side. On the morning of the fifth day, the Karluks attacked the Chinese army from the left flank, and the Muslim forces entered the battle and attacked them from the front. It is not clear.
Okay, these are different accounts, but, I mean, we clearly have some similarities here. In both accounts, well, in one account, neither side attacked each other for several days. In the other account, there was sort of a stalemate for several days. So in both accounts, nothing decisive happened for a couple of days. There's a similarity. Another similarity in both accounts is that you have basically a third power, a third force attacking the Chinese, which gives the Caliphate the advantage and allows them to win the battle. In the first account, it's a betrayal. In the second account, it's just an independent third force entering into the battle. So, though these are two different accounts, from the similarities, what we can gather is that probably, for a couple of days, there wasn't many decisive moves, right? It was maybe going back and forth, or maybe nothing was happening at all. And then, eventually, some third force came in, whether they betrayed the Chinese or they came in from elsewhere or whatever, and that gave the Muslims the advantage to win this battle. And this is what we have to do when we have conflicting sources. We have to look at what they have in common and see, okay, can we parse out some truth from this? And once again, this is all speculation from me. This is still a guess, but judging from how they've presented it, this is sort of what I would make of that.
If the Karluks and Arabs planned this, but in any case, the Chinese army was broken, and only a few thousand of the troops close to Gao were able to escape. The Tang sent new armies to the area and contained Arabian expansion, but in 755, a great rebellion started in China, and the troops operating in Central Asia had...
And we talked about this when we did our last Sassanids video. This big rebellion, one of the consequences of that rebellion was that funding to a lot of these foreign nobles at the Chinese court was cut off. Foreign nobles like, for example, the Sassanid Persian court, which had been stationed in China. So a lot of the funding was cut off from people like them. So, there's an impact that we've already seen.
To return home. The Abbasids also failed to establish stable control over these lands, and Turkic influence continued to rise.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know too much about the region, but when I think of Central Asia, I still think of a rather independent nomadic region controlled by a lot of the tribes in that area. I don't think of necessarily an area dominated by the Caliphate or China, at least not until... much later. And then, of course, we have a lot of independent countries down the line. So it seems like neither power really managed to establish serious long-term control over the region. Of course, if we look in the long term, both China and the Caliphate have the issue of not necessarily being united in purpose in the long term. China goes through dynasties constantly. We can look at the Caliphate. There's a lot of crumbling and reforming with different dynasties and, all that kind of stuff. It can be kind of difficult to establish long-term dominance when you don't have stable leadership, especially if we're talking over the span of hundreds and hundreds of years.
The Battle of Talas had a number of implications. The influence of Buddhism in the region was on the decline after it, and as China and India were no longer connected via land, differences between the two branches of Buddhism in these countries became more prominent throughout the centuries. Meanwhile, the Turks started adopting Islam, and that set up the Seljuk conquests in the Middle East, the Crusades, the fall of Byzantium, and the rise of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, interesting. So, though the Caliphate didn't necessarily hold a firm grasp over Central Asia, Islam started to spread. And of course, if we fast forward, a lot of these tribes, a lot of these peoples in this area will become Muslim. They just mentioned the Seljuk Turks. That's a great example. The Seljuk Turks will be very important in the future. They will play a big role in a couple of conflicts. And of course, there are a lot of other peoples from that region who will become Muslim and spread that religion further. So that is a very interesting impact.
And most importantly of all, paper-making technology, which was previously kept secret by the Chinese states, was stolen by the Abbasids and found its way to the Middle East and Europe.
Wow. Now that's a massive, that's one of those impacts that it might seem like a little thing there, but in the long term, the consequences of that would be extremely difficult to examine because they're so broad. That's the point I'm making. Bringing paper-making technology, which I knew was taken by the Caliphate, and then, of course, was spread even further westwards into Europe. This will be real important for hundreds, 1,000+ years to come.
Thank you for watching our documentary.
All right. I enjoyed that one. That was a real interesting one. You know, we've been doing a lot of Asian history lately, and I've been saying for a while now that I wanted to expand the scope of what we're doing. You know, I like to learn new things, fill in some of the gaps that I have in my historical knowledge. And trust me, like everybody else, I've got a lot of gaps in my historical knowledge. One of those is a lot of Asian history. And so we've been doing more of that lately. Of course, this is sort of, a combination of Asian and Middle Eastern history. I don't know what you want to call it. But a real interesting topic. A battle that, like I said, I hadn't heard of before this, but one that seems very important in the long term. Also a really interesting one, of course, China versus the Caliphate. Two forces you don't expect to see coming together, fighting each other, right? So yeah, I enjoyed this video. It was on a real interesting topic. If you guys did, please leave a like, subscribe. If you have any video recommendations on really any sort of history, like I said, we've been doing a lot of Asian history lately, so anything on that would be great, but also any Muslim history, European, anything else. I'm open to any good recommendations you guys have. I like to keep the topics we look at varied and broad. I think it keeps things fresh. So, leave any recommendations down below. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.